Alright, so here's strewn out in front of me. I have three cameras, and at a glance, they're all pretty much the same camera, and in reality, they are pretty much all the same camera. But they are in fact different. This is a Nikon SP, this is the Nikon S3, and this is the somewhat rare Nikon S4. And I'm just going to go over a brief overview and kind of describe what the differences are between these cameras and which one you might prefer if you plan on buying one of these cameras. So I think first I'll start off with the SP, because that is the first one to come out in the line. And this is actually Nikon's first professional camera. It's very similar to the other two, and it's not too different from the Nikon S2, which came out a few years earlier. But it does have quite a few differences. One big thing that differs it from the S2 is the shutter speed knob. All the speeds are on the single knob. It's not that double stacked knob that the S2 had. I actually don't own an S2. I would compare, but I don't own one, so I can't really show them to you. And possibly the biggest difference, and the one that's really going to make most people want this camera, is the viewfinder. The S2 had a viewfinder that only had 50mm frame lines in it. This camera has two viewfinders technically. It has this central viewfinder right here, which has the rangefinder focusing mechanism, and it will cover 50, 85, 105, and 135 frame lines. You also have a second viewfinder right here that has 35mm frame lines, and the overall viewfinder is quite a bit larger, and it roughly works as a 28mm finder. It's not perfect. It does seem to aim just a little bit low. It'll trim off a little bit at the top from what I've seen, but it is pretty close, and I think it works pretty well if you want to pick up one of these cameras to use with the 28, because the 28mm purpose-made viewfinders are pretty hard to find. So this is a very good alternative if you just want a slightly more compact package. Another thing is the light meter. I did a little video on this before. This is a V201X light meter. They're pretty cheap. You can get them for about 60 bucks plus a little shipping, I think. And I love the way it looks on these cameras. Just the sort of aluminum finish is very close to the chrome on these cameras, and you can see it has almost a perfect form factor fit. It is a tad bit loose compared to some other light meters, but if you put a little tape on there, it should hold it on pretty well. And I like to have one of these light meters on at all times, so a lot of times I prefer to shoot the 28mm lens on this camera, use the built-in finder even if it is a little inaccurate, and then have the convenience of the light meter right here. I also really like to use the 85mm lens on this camera because it's the only Nikon camera that has 85mm view lines, strangely enough. And that's one of my favorite lenses. I'll probably have to go over the lenses more later on, but this specific video is more about the cameras themselves and not so much the lenses. So I think that kind of sums it up for the SP. I would open it up, but it does have film in it right now, so I'm going to try not to mess with it too much. From there we have the S3. This one with a 35mm f2.8 lens. That's the normal lens I shoot on here. So this one is a little different. It has the primary finder has 35, 50, and 105mm frame lines, all built into the same viewfinder. These also have parallax correction marks, which the SP does not have. This was actually I believe the first Nikon camera to have the parallax correction in the viewfinder. I guess technically the SP does have parallax correction marks in the wide-angle finder with the with the 35mm lens, but it does not have them for the other lenses. This offers parallax correction for all three focal lengths, and I like it. I like the 35mm lens, and I think this is a great combo here. And again, you can just have this combo, the 35, the camera, toss a light meter on it, and it's very compact. I find it to be very reliable, and I like it. I like the form factor. There's really not many complaints about it. I guess you could argue the lenses probably aren't ultra sharp. A lot of people are going to inevitably compare them to Leica lenses, which I think is a pretty fair comparison. I think the Leicas are a little bit sharper, but I mean, unless you're somebody who really is one of those sharpness hounds, there's not really much to complain about. I know some people will say that the rangefinder patches in the viewfinder will sort of deteriorate over time, and they're not especially contrasty and visible. And it's hard for me to comment on that because all these cameras I have, it's very good on the SP and the S4. It is a little weaker on the S3, but it's still pretty usable. And from what I've seen, it's not really much worse than any Leica out there. I've never really owned a Leica. I did technically own a Leica 3 for a couple of years, and I was not a big fan of it. It had some issues, and it was just, they're very dated cameras that I don't think really translate very well for modern users. So I much prefer the S3. Just the fact that you have multiple frame lines in the viewfinder, and you can use multiple lenses with it is great. That's something you can't do with the old screw mount Leicas. And I think these Nikon lenses are a lot sharper than pretty much any of the Leica screw mount lenses. I'm sure a lot of people would argue against that, but from what I've seen, these are at worst comparable to the Leica screw mount lenses, but I would say generally better, and you get a lot more variety. You get much faster apertures, so even if you do lose some sharpness, you gain so much lens speed that I think it's a very fair trade-off. Again, not a whole lot more to say about this camera. This is kind of the standard model, and I can kind of see why. Banging them together, I'm going to scratch them up even more. But I like it. I would say if you're going to buy one of these cameras, the S3 is probably the way to go. They seem to be the most common, and they generally seem to be the cheapest. And I think you just get enough usability and versatility out of it. It's not something you can really go wrong with if you want to shoot film. I'm sure some people will say, oh, well, you know, it doesn't have really specific features like some of the Leicas. Or, oh, you can't really use very specific lenses with it. And yeah, I guess all that's true, but, you know, for what it is, I think it's about as good as they could make it. So last of all, I'll move on to the S4. And the S4 is actually the last rangefinder Nikon ever made, well, at least in this line with the S series. And I think they were only released in Japan, and they're pretty rare, with production numbers only being around 5,000 or 6,000. It's pretty much the same thing as the S3. I mean, all these cameras are pretty much the same. You can see they all have the same back and bottom plate. They all have the same shutter speed dial, the same little cuff around the shutter right there. They're same rewind knob. The interior workings are pretty much the same. The S4 is just a slightly stripped down version of the S3, so it does not have the self timer. That's one of the big differences, and I actually kind of prefer it without the self timer. It's just a little easier to hold. The other really noticeable thing is the film advance levers. The S3 has this nice resetting film advance lever that automatically resets to 0 anytime you take off the back and put it back on. And it also has a little tab where you can mark a 20 or 36 shot roll, which is kind of useful. The S4 goes with a much simpler one that's just kind of a knob you have to manually reset, and it doesn't have a little tab to show you what type of roll you have in there. But it's still very on par with what was on the S and the S2, so I think it's pretty usable. Another thing is they do not have the 35mm frame lines in the viewfinder. The viewfinder is just as wide, so the entirety of the viewfinder is pretty much 35mm, so if you really want to use a 35mm lens on here, you can, but the S3 is probably kind of preferable. There's not a huge difference in price from what I've seen. I know at one point the S4s were considered to be really rare and were selling for a couple of $1,000s, but nowadays they usually only sell for about maybe $100 to $200 above an S3, and I'm sure a lot of people will say, no, that's not accurate. And I mean, this is what I'm saying from what I've seen in like 2020, 2019, in that time frame. Usually the S4s are only about, I'll say maybe $200 more expensive than an S3. I don't really have many complaints about it. It's a lot simpler than the S3, and if you want to shoot a 50mm lens or the 105, I think this is probably the camera to use. It just has a nice form factor. Again, I really like the fact it doesn't have this self-timer. The self-timer can kind of be useful every once in a while, but I just much prefer the feel of it not being there. So that's pretty much it for the differences and descriptions of the camera. There's not a whole lot more I can say about them. I wish I had a Leica to compare them to, but I don't. Another thing I might want to note is apparently this SP right here is an early production model, and apparently the viewfinder is much higher contrast than later models, and it has a few other features like the film advance lever is a solid piece of metal, whereas on later models it's like a pressed piece of tin that's hollow. So if you can find one of these early SPs, I think they're very worth it. I think it's about the first 1,500 serial numbers or so. They're very good cameras, very reliable, and just the viewfinders are great. I really like them. I don't really have any complaints. I don't think I would trade one of these cameras for a Leica if somebody offered it to me. I don't think I'd really sell them. I think I plan on keeping them for a very long time. And I've had other cameras. I had a Nikon FM2T, and it's actually right here. And again, this is a very good camera. It's a little bit lighter, being made out of titanium, and it does have a built-in meter, which is great, but you can use all the F-mount lenses. There's a lot more F-mount lenses than these old S-mount lenses, but I still kind of prefer the S-series cameras, even though they're a little bit heavier. There's not a huge difference. It's just a couple of ounces, but you'll see with the form factor, without the little mirror box and with the smaller lenses, they usually end up taking up a lot less space. Can't really do a great comparison there. But they are smaller. You can fit these in a jacket pocket, especially if you have one of the shorter, like the 35 or 28mm lenses on. and I like that. It's very easy to put them in a small camera bag with lots of extra film and maybe an extra lens, or to just slip them in a jacket pocket. That's not something you can really do with an F series because they're so much thicker. You can't really do that. I do like the built-in light meters these have, and they have faster shutter speeds. Most of them go to 1/2000th or 1/4000th of a second. That's really nice. But I still kind of prefer. I really like these cameras. That's all I can say. One more comparison is a Canonet. A lot of people are familiar with these. Very common budget camera. They've got a good lens. It's a built-in lens, but it's a pretty good lens. They've got a very good rangefinder, viewfinder setup. They've got a nice tracking parallax correction. They do technically have an automatic shutter, but it always seems to be kind of spotty. It seems like the batteries are hard to find, and they don't generally work too accurately. But I think a lot of people really love this camera. It's kind of a cult following. But I still prefer the Nikons, because if you look at them, the size is pretty similar. Let me do one of these without the case. Nikon's a tad bit longer there, but not by a whole lot. And if you look at the height, they're almost exactly the same height. They're almost exactly the same thickness. You just get the a little bit more camera length out of the SPs. And yes, you do technically lose the automatic features, which, as I said, rarely seem to work on this camera. But I think it's kind of worth it again, because you get the interchangeable lenses. You have a faster shutter speed. You have a 1/1000th of a second here as compared to a 1/500th on the Canonets. And you have quite a few common lenses. There's multiple 35s and 50s. There's a 28 that's pretty easy to find. There's various 85s and 105s. There's the 135 is very common and very cheap. All those lenses are very common and very cheap, and you have rare ones. You have super fast, like the 51.1, and the really wide angle ones like the 21 and 25 millimeter lenses. Those are pretty rare and usually very expensive, but they are out there if you really want to pursue them. Recently, Voigtlander actually made some lenses that fit on here. I forget what series they are. I think they're part of the Color Subcore lineup, and they're pretty similar to most of the existing lenses. I know there's a 50 and a 35, and then I think there's a 28 and one of the wider angle 25s. I think that's all they really made. There might be a 21 as well. But they're not terribly expensive. They're usually a little bit more expensive than the old Nikon lenses, but you have those as well, and those are supposed to be kind of sharper lenses. So you have those options. There's a few generic offerings from the time, but they're usually quite rare. I think, I don't even know the company names, but I know there were a few companies that made generic lenses in Japan that would be compatible with Nikon cameras. Most of them were 35 millimeter lenses that were not super fast, like f3.5, and I think some of them were like 135 millimeter lenses that were around f4. I wish I could remember the company names. I know you can find them here and there, but they're usually pretty hard to find, and I don't think their quality is really any better than the Nikon lenses, which run around the same price range, so I would just stick with the Nikon gear. And I don't know what else I can say here. That's pretty much my 2 cents on the Nikon rangefinders. I'd like to do another video later where I kind of, if I can, maybe compare them to a Leica or something. And I'd like to go over the lenses more and do some things like that, so let me know what you think. And hopefully this was helpful to you.